a freedom of speech in your opinion, especially in journalism?
Well, freedom of speech is about being able to publish what you see as the truth without influence by some form of authority telling you what you can or cannot say. And usually there are certain standards of journalism that apply. Things like how many sources you should have before you're publishing something, how many things, what kind of verifications. And as long as you follow those, you should be, a free press should be free to publish whatever it is that they conclude, without a government or without any other special interest interfering.
Okay, the second question is, how can the press be protected from the restriction of freedom of speech?
This is about Singapore in particular?
Yeah, Singapore.
I think one of the one of the first things. Okay, there's sort of two things that come to mind. The first thing is ownership. Okay. One of the reasons why many complain that what the media environment that you have in Singapore is not really free in that sense is because the government owns all of the big media outlets. They own the newspapers, they own the television and radio stations, etc. Right? That's where the ownership part comes in. And the reason why ownership plays a big deal is because the owners of the public of a media outlet inevitably, even if you say there's editorial separation between management and the editorial team, etc., there is still going to be some kind of influence if these are the guys paying your paycheck, and if these are the guys who have the ability to fire you, right? There's always going to be that level of influence. The second thing is that in order to be free of being accused of anything that would require or would entice something like a government to interfere, is that you also have to get the story right? You have to have very high standards of integrity, high standards of accuracy as journalists. So I think those are the two kind of main things, because if anybody says you shouldn't have published this, you shouldn't have said this, if you've done your work correctly as a journalist, you can say, oh, but here's proof that that's true. Why should I not publish it if it's true, right? Because I've got this source and I've got this source. And both demonstrate, the fact that they verify each other shows that this is true. Or if you have evidence or something like that. It's very hard for anybody to dispute if you have the truth on your side.
Okay, so the next question is, why freedom of speech is so important in journalism?
Well, it's important because I think the highest calling and the highest authority that good journalism answers to has to be the truth. And you can't. It's only genuine freedom if you're allowed to publish the truth. If you're not allowed to publish the truth, if the truth is in any way hidden, if the truth is in any way downplayed, then that is no longer real press freedom. So I think the first duty of a journalist and the first duty of a news organization is to print and publish and report the truth. And there should be nothing that hinders them from doing that.
Okay, the next one is, where do we draw the line on freedom of speech?
Wow, that is a very, very good question. And it's very hard to, there's no simple answer to it. So let's say, for example, and this is true even in a place like the United States, which arguably has, the freest media environment in the world. Even journalists have been asked by the government to delay a story or not do a story in the interest of the public interest, what the government says is the public interest. So let's say, for example, during the missile crisis in the 1960s, the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, I think it was the Washington Post, found out about some of the stuff that was going on behind the scenes, the fact that the Soviet Union was putting missiles into Cuba, etc., and what the U.S. was doing about it. The Kennedy government talked to the publisher of the Washington Post, I think it was the Washington Post, and said, please don't publish the story because American lives are at stake, right? You're going to endanger American lives if you do that, because there's an action that we're undertaking. If the public finds out beforehand, that means, our enemies may find out also, and therefore, there are lives in the balance. And there's all kinds of occasions throughout history where something similar has happened. Now, I think, for me, that's why there's no simple clear-cut case. It's really on a case-to-case basis, and it's really down to the judgment of the publisher or the editor at that moment in time. Where I think the case becomes really dodgy is if the only reason for suppressing something is purely political, right? If it's something that would make somebody look bad, or may affect him in the polls, or may affect public opinion of him. But again, if it's true and the public has a right to know the truth, then that should prevail. That should be more important.
Next one is, what do you think the Singapore's anti-fake news law is struggle against freedom of speech?
Yeah, so I think the biggest problem with the whole idea of fake news is the most fundamental question is who decides what's fake and what's not. And if the answer is the government, that is not to me that's not a satisfactory answer. The second thing you have to consider is what was the motivation of the law in the first place. Because, for example, if you say, oh, we want to protect the truth, or we want to save the public from misinformation, right? That's kind of like the rationale. If somebody publishes an article that says if you eat bacon every day, it's good for your heart, that's obviously fake news. That's obviously not real, right? But if somebody publishes that, is the government going to run after them and shut down their publication? I don't think they will. And so if they're being selective about what they do pursue and what they don't pursue, then you're kind of like, okay, so you then look at the patterns of what is it that they do pursue then. And if you find out that the answer, that the pattern is that they only interfere when it's something to do with politics, when it's something that makes the government look bad or makes certain government officials look bad, then you're forced to question the integrity of the law and the intent of the law. Because then you're like, if you're going to pursue this because it's what you call misinformation, and it's misinformation that damages you personally, why aren't you pursuing all the other misinformation that doesn't have anything to do with you, if this was really just about the truth? And so that for me raises all kinds of questions as to what, as to, number one, who decides what's real or what's not. Because, by the way, even if you take that, okay, that's more of an extreme example, but let's say you'll see the articles like this all the time, right? Like, if you drink red wine every day, it's good for your heart. There's actually different medical points of view on that. Some doctors will say any kind of alcohol that you take regularly is bad. There are other doctors that will say, oh, but red wine has vitamins, and red wine is good for your circulation, and blah, blah, blah. So these are actually opposing medical points of view. So where's the truth then? Who decides what's real or what's not, right? So that's the first thing, is like, what's real? Who decides? And if the government says, well, we decide, then the obvious thing is like, well, why do you get to decide? Why do you think why are you saying that you have an authority, you have the last word on what is quote unquote true? And the second thing is, what's the intention? Like, what was the intention of the law in the first place? The potential of it, the potential danger, is that all it does is it makes it harder and harder for independent media to come out. You know, it makes it harder for, if there's this constant threat that a media company will get sued or get shut down because they published something that was quote unquote untrue, then that obviously hinders the growth of new voices, alternate voices, dissenting voices. Oh, there's a third point. The third point is, isn't it redundant anyway? Because there already are libel laws. Singapore already has some of the strongest libel laws in the world. So what else? Why do you need this extra set of laws for?
So the next question is, who will be affected by government approach to anti-fake news law?
I think the main people who will be affected are independent publishers. You know, people who want to start their own media companies, people who are creating their own content, you know, commercial content, right? And I think the danger is whether or not they are even, you know, covering politics or covering news. Most of it has to do with news, by the way, because that's kind of where the government is concerned, is quote unquote news. But whatever the hell, I mean, where do you draw the line of what's news and what's not news, right? It's, at the end of the day, it's all news. And so I think those are mainly the people who will be affected, right? The smaller companies, the independent publishers, the guys who are trying to, you know, make a buck out of an opportunity that they see in the market, which is creating content for profit. It just makes it harder, and it just creates more of a threatening situation for those guys. You know, when arguably it's not really necessary.
Next is, what do you think is the relationship between anti-fake news law and the freedom of speech?
Yeah, so I think the main implication is if the anti-fake news laws are used to silence dissenting points of view, right? It's hard to, I mean, let's say an independent news publisher comes into some information and publishes a point of view. And that, you know, not all points of view, not all kinds of news can be factually proven. Some of it is just kind of incidental. Sometimes you string 3 different facts together and come up with a conclusion. And a different person could put those 3 facts together and come up with a different conclusion. So what happens when they put together one conclusion and the government says that's the wrong conclusion, right? Then they can call that person out for publishing something quote unquote untrue. Whereas the way journalism is supposed to work in a free media environment is that you publish different dissenting points of view. I mean, freedom at the end of the day is not about everybody agreeing, it's about different people allowing people to present different dissenting points of view, and you as the individual get to decide which of these is correct for you, right? And so that's the danger, is that if it quiets too much of these dissenting points of view, where the only point of view that's allowed is the one that's sponsored by the state.
The next is, what do you think is the future tree of freedom of speech in Singapore, especially in journalism? Will the public or the journalists be free to speak, or will the government more control?
Interesting. It's hard to say. As I said earlier, I think that the environment you have today is already much more lax, much more lenient than it used to be. But yet, every now and then, you know, you're seeing the system kind of groan and creak as it tries to get pushed in a different direction, right? I think what it seems to me is that these are all signs that we're coming to a turning point. And ultimately, there's going to have to be a decision made whether the media environment will become tighter, controlled, or become more free. And I think, personally, the more free option is inevitable because of the internet, right? This is just going to happen anyway. And I think the government is smart enough to realize that if they try to control more and they try to say, you know, only MediaCorp and SPH are the ones that have the right to talk about these things, the public is just going to consume those media outlets less, and start looking for alternative media, which will come up anyway, just because of the way the internet works. And, you know, what could easily happen is that, you know, you end up with a lot of news being published outside of Singapore about Singapore, which the government can't even touch or can't run after. So what happens then, right? If you have a situation where the public no longer trusts the official state media and is only looking at alternate media now, because of the way the internet, because of the fact that the internet is there, that's a very real possibility. But I don't think that the government is that dumb. I think they know that there's a balance to be struck, and that they're trying to find that balance right now. So I think but you know, as we get there, there's going to be, you know, a little bit of like 3 steps forward, 2 steps back kind of thing. You know, as the media environment just becomes more and more liberalized. Yes? Oh,
Oolong.
thank you.
Okay.
Hot.
Okay, thanks.
The next one is, do you think anti-fake news law is affecting freedom of speech in Singapore?
I think it's too early to say. It depends on how it's actually applied. I think it's still kind of early days to see whether it's really going to be, you know, how they're going to apply the law or not. Yeah, so I don't have an answer in the short term. I don't really see how it is. It all depends on how vigorously the law is pursued going forward.
The last one is, what the role that the government is playing in freedom of speech?
What role do they play?
Yeah, the government that they are freedom of speech.
On the one hand, sure, the government has a lot of influence over, you know, mainstream media or state-owned media. But at the other hand, the government also has to realize that the more they push back, the more the public will push back, right? And you know, I think just because we're on this path now where Singapore is increasingly seeing more and more exposure to the outside world, exposure to information, whether it's officially from the government or not, or officially sanctioned by the government or not. I think the expectation of having more and more freedom of expression, freedom of speech it's just going to increase. People are going to look for more of that. And the more they try to reverse that, the more detrimental it will actually become for the government. And I think they know it. I think they know that. I think that's why a lot of things have become more relaxed just in the 2 decades since I've been living here. I can see it myself. So if they're smart, they will allow more of that to happen, and interfere less. and just kind of demonstrate in other ways that they're doing a good job. I don't know if that's what they're going to end up doing. I think the government also suffers from a lot of its old habits, and so I don't know how easy that transition is going to be. I think it's going to be quite painful for some people.